Right, so as far as the ongoing atrocity in Gaza goes, often people here in the UK will be asking themselves, well, what can we do? What change can we affect here? And that might be by refusing to buy goods from Israel, for example, or protesting and demonstrating against what it's doing in Gaza, and indeed against our government, who are, as we know, still supplying arms to Israel. But no matter how much we kick off, it doesn't seem to matter. No matter how many times a newspaper or a mouthpiece like me might point to the violations of the Genocide Convention or the Geneva Conventions, the government doesn't seem to be perturbed by this. Then there is the most recent debacle over legal advice the government have received on these matters, which they refuse to publish, but claim they are acting within international law over, but which becomes harder to believe following leaked audio from a Tory MP implying otherwise. Why is it that our politicians think these rules don't matter to us, or matter to them? And indeed, we could look at Israel's own government in the same light here, and it comes down to the very simple but very sad fact that they don't actually fear any repercussions for what they are doing, because prosecutions of such acts never seem to happen. What is the point of international law, therefore, if it is never upheld? Right, so our unelected Foreign Secretary David Cameron has been to the US and from there made an absolutely rancid declaration that despite audio leaks regarding legal advice the government had received, implying that that advice stated that Israel was in breach of international law, that the government would continue to claim it was following international law by continuing arms sales to the regime and expect us to keep on trusting them on that because that legal advice was not going to be published. Nothing quite screams honesty and transparency in government quite like covering up the very legal advice everyone wants to see, and convention be damned when it comes to such legal advice when we deserve to know if our elected government is engaged in aiding and abetting in genocide in our names, does it? His remarks have been reported as, "The latest assessment leaves our position on export licenses unchanged. The overall judgment is those export licenses will remain open and continue." I'm really not quite sure how much more damage to Gaza needs to be done to actually stop those arms licenses or exports, especially when all of this comes in the aftermath of some 33,000 dead Gazans, some of which, the ordnance of which was almost certainly supplied by us, and closer to home those 3 British aid workers being killed by the IDF whilst trying to deliver said aid, allegedly targeted by a drone whose engine was developed here in the UK, the company who designed it having been acquired by Israeli arms firm Elbit Systems. But there's another video about that. But be it Palestinian life or foreign national life, there seems to be very little value placed on it by Israel if these people are in Gaza, and by extension those pledged to continue the supply of arms to them, and if Cameron's to be believed, the people supplying the government with their legal advice. Now on one hand, the Tories might try to justify this as being important to UK-Israel relations. The two share intelligence and the like, national security cited again, and so on and so forth. But that is, in my view, a very, very weak excuse, when I think more people here are certainly concerned about the loss of life as a result of continuing arms sales and any perceived risk to us here in the UK. So is that really justification enough for potentially ignoring international law then? I don't think so. We need to see the legal advice here. Even some Tories are saying as much now. But so far Cameron isn't going to budge on this, raising suspicions all the more. It's actually worth talking about these export licenses for arms to Israel for a moment too, because how does such a license come into existence anyway? What checks are done to get one, both initially and ongoing? Because Cameron's comment from a moment ago implies very much that the legal advice the government have received not only apparently assures the government that they are on the right side of international law, but that these licenses remain unaffected by that advice as well. All in stark contrast, of course, to the leaked audio by Tory MP and chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns, back on the 13th of March. So getting on for a month ago now, which continues to be a great big genocidal elephant in the room, which continues to go unacknowledged because she said in that recording that the legal advice said that Israel were in breach of international law. And this is why we need to see the advice published. Because if Kearns was being truthful, as I said in a video recently, Cameron's position would be utterly untenable. He has lied about this. And he should have resigned already if that's the case. He may now, in fact, just be making that case for that even bigger. But on that matter of export licenses, though, an internal review was conducted by the government after October 7th into this. That has been seen by Middle East Eye, who have reported on this, and they've concluded that 28 arms export licenses covering items from aircraft components to targeting equipment were most likely to be used by Israel in Gaza. This is what the government has said. Their own report has said. So on what possible basis can Cameron claim these licenses can remain open then? So not only is he refusing to publish legal advice, but he's refusing to quash export licenses to Israel, which his own government have been flagging as a concern. Seems obvious to conclude just from this that our government must be knowingly supplying Israel via these arms export licenses, knowing full well what they are supplying is almost certainly being used in Gaza. If Cameron should have resigned before now, he needs to do it twice for good measure at this point, just so we know he's definitely gone. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say the export license scandal, because it is a scandal in its own right by the sounds of things, woefully underreported as well, which is another scandal of our own media, has been widely told. Middle East Eye are very much not a mainstream publication, but are an exceptionally good independent source. However, the legal advice not being produced, that is a story more widely known, and very much festering away. So why is Cameron and the rest of this Tory government so set on carrying on regardless of international law, it seems? Well, journalist Peter Oborne wrote in his column for, again, Middle East Eye, Cameron now faces the very real prospect of going down in history as the British Foreign Secretary who gave the green light to Israeli genocide in Gaza. That's one heck of a statement. And Oborne is himself, well, he would tell you himself, he's a former Tory voter himself, not so keen on the current bunch though, not much like most of the rest of us. But it brings me finally really to the crux of this video, which is to say, what do the government, what do people like Cameron or Sunak really have to fear from this? Think about it. Think of all the wars and warmongers we've seen come and go that this country's been involved with. Tony Blair, probably the classic example these days, the one you instantly think of. How many of us have said for years that he belongs in The Hague for his part in an internationally unsanctioned war in the Middle East, based on what turned out to be a pack of lies over WMDs, and instead of ending up in The Hague, he ended up becoming Middle East peace envoy. What a joke. But unfortunately, that is what international law has become regarded as, because wherever is the enforcement. Israel's attacks on Gaza, if not for South Africa, there would be no mitigating orders having been handed down to Israel. Israel, however, completely ignored them, shielded as they have been by the US, not upholding international law, but stymieing it every time they vetoed a ceasefire. The rules that are supposed to be globally universal and apply to all are not upheld. So is it any wonder Israel flagrantly ignored every order given to them, ignored the latest ceasefire, ignored calls for aid to be let in, have destroyed everything in their path and killed whoever seemingly was in their path, whether they were protected by international law or not? Here's another relevant passage from this Middle East Eye article on this subject. Anna Stavrianakis, International Relations Professor at the University of Sussex and Director of Research and Strategy at UK-based Shadow World Investigations, noted that the Business Department's affidavit showed that as early as 10th of November, government lawyers had been worried about Israeli compliance with international humanitarian law. It is hard to imagine that the updated legal advice has got any more confident about Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law, and the government refuses to publish it, Stavrianakis told MEE, Middle East Eye. This leads me to conclude that David Cameron has made the assessment that there is no clear risk, a position that flies in the face of all publicly available evidence. No clear risk. And that is either to the government and to Cameron personally. So where's the failure to uphold the law then? I suppose it goes to the UN, doesn't it? And their body for prosecutions at individual levels, which is the International Criminal Court at The Hague, and their chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, whose brother, until his recent fall from grace, was a Tory MP. Does having one of their own at the ICC give British politicians further protection, or is it more the case that Khan has seemingly gone out of his way to ignore cases to do with Israel since October 7th? There's no pressure on any of these MPs to do the right thing. They likely see that there's no risk to themselves, despite enabling genocide as we see it, and when supported in what they are doing by Labour, although even they have called for the legal advice to be published. But I, for one, don't trust pro-Israeli interests, Zionists like Starmer is, Labour friends of Israel like Cameron's shadow counterpart David Lammy is. Because if they were in any power, do you really believe they would be doing things any differently? Do you? For as long as politicians have no fear of any consequences for their actions, even as heinous and genocidal as these ones, what pressure is them to act within international law? But equally, when lawmen don't work to uphold such matters, what is the point of there even being a relevant law? The ICC and the ICJ have been accused of pro-Western biases before. I covered Karim Khan in more detail in this video here, which asked if the ICC is indeed compromised. This might get you thinking about that if you care to watch. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.